She stood there, exposed and humiliated, as they shaved her head in the town square while everyone watched. The cruel punishment designed to mark her as an outcast left her trembling under the merciless sun until he appeared, the cowboy who defied them all when he covered her bare head with his hat and sealed his rebellion with a kiss. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. August in Dry Creek was merciless. The Wyoming Territory sun beating down on the dusty town square like God's own judgment. The heat rose in waves from the packed dirt, but it wasn't enough to keep the townsfolk away from the promised spectacle. They gathered in a tightening circle, faces gleaming with sweat and anticipation, murmuring as they waited for the show to begin. Evelyn Harper stood in the center, her wrists bound with rough rope that bit into her skin. The schoolteacher had committed the unforgivable sin of questioning the town elders about missing school funds. Money meant for books and supplies that had mysteriously vanished. For her trouble, she'd been branded a troublemaker, accused of impropriety and moral corruption of the town's youth. "Let this serve as a lesson," Mayor Thornton bellowed, his voice carrying across the square. "We don't tolerate those who question authority in Dry Creek." The crowd's energy shifted, feeding on itself, growing more hostile with each passing moment. Children who had sat in Evelyn's classroom just days before now watched wide-eyed as their parents jeered. She caught sight of Maid Doyle standing apart from the others, the saloon owner's face unreadable, but her eyes sharp with something that might have been respect. When they brought out the shears, Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. Two men held her shoulders, while a third began cutting away her long chestnut hair. Each snip echoed in her ears like gunfire. Locks fell around her feet, forming a sad halo in the dust. The smell of burnt hair lingered as the metal blades heated in the sun. Tears threatened, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she lowered her gaze, shame washing over her in suffocating waves. The crowd's laughter died suddenly, replaced by confused murmurs. Through the throng came Jonah Callahan, the silent cowboy known more for his skill with horses than words. He moved with deliberate purpose, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Without hesitation, he stepped directly in front of Evelyn. The cowboy removed his weathered hat with a gentle motion that seemed at odds with his calloused hands. With unexpected tenderness, he placed it on her shorn head, his fingers briefly brushing against her scalp. Then, before anyone could react, Jonah tilted her chin upward with his thumb and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss wasn't passionate or dramatic, just a simple, defiant gesture that transformed the mood in an instant. The jeering faces fell silent, stunned by this unexpected act of solidarity. When he pulled away, Jonah's eyes met Evelyn's, communicating something wordless but profound. In that moment, humiliation transformed into something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like hope. A deafening silence hung over the town square, broken only by the distant call of a crow. Jonah Callahan's hat sat atop Evelyn Harper's head, shielding her dignity where her hair once was. The crowd stood frozen, unsure whether to disperse or stay for what might happen next. Sheriff Henry Lowe's hand hovered near his holster, his weathered face contorted with indecision. "Get back to your business," the sheriff finally barked. Though his authority seemed to waver, the townspeople shuffled away reluctantly, glancing back at the schoolteacher and the cowboy who stood beside her. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she adjusted the wide-brimmed hat. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, though gratitude shone in her eyes. "Some things need doing," Jonah replied simply, offering his arm to escort her home. By sundown, Jonah's defiant kiss had become legend in Dry Creek. At May Doyle's saloon, patrons huddled over whiskey glasses, their voices animated with fresh gossip. "Never thought the quiet one had it in him," a ranch hand muttered, tossing back his drink. May wiped down the bar with practice strokes. "Sometimes it's the quiet ones you ought to watch," she said, her shrewd eyes taking in the room. The saloon owner had always had a soft spot for the schoolteacher, though few knew it. Across town in the sheriff's office, Silas Ward pounded his fist on the desk. "This kind of insubordination can't stand, Henry. That woman was being made an example of." The lawman shifted uncomfortably. "It's done now. Can't arrest a man for kindness." "Kindness?" Silas spat. "It was rebellion, plain and simple." Outside, the evening train whistled as it approached the edge of town, its distant rumble a reminder of the changes bearing down on Dry Creek. The railroad's advance meant progress, opportunity, and threats to the established order, much like Jonah's simple act of defiance. In her small home, Eveline sat before a mirror, fingers gently touching the jagged remains of her hair. The hat, his hat, lay on her table. Tears threatened, but she blinked them away. The humiliation had been meant to break her, yet somehow she felt stronger. Meanwhile, in the poorer quarter of town, whispers of a different sort circulated. The laundress who'd been cheated by the general store, the blacksmith's apprentice who'd been denied fair wages, the immigrant families who lived on the outskirts, all found hope in what they'd witnessed. "If Callahan can stand up to them," an old miner said to his companions, "maybe it's time we all did." As night fell completely over Dry Creek, the town seemed to hold its breath. Something fundamental had shifted, like the first crack in a dam before the flood. The hierarchy that had stood unchallenged for years suddenly seemed less immutable, less certain, and the railroad whistle called again from the darkness, promising that tomorrow would not be the same as yesterday. The evening air carried a chill as Jonah Callahan stood on Eveline Harper's porch, hat in hand. His weathered face betrayed concern as he proposed his solution. "You could start fresh elsewhere," he said quietly. "I know folks in Cheyenne who'd welcome a teacher of your caliber." Eveline's newly shorn head caught the lantern light as she shook it firmly. "I won't be driven out, Jonah. This is my home, my school, my purpose." Her fingers traced the edge of his hat, the same one he'd placed on her head in the square. The schoolteacher's eyes held a determination that surprised even herself. "If I leave, they win. The children lose." The following morning, Eveline found a notice nailed to the schoolhouse door. 6 families had withdrawn their children. Citing her moral failing and unsuitable character, she tore it down, hands trembling not with fear, but with anger. Inside, the classroom bore signs of vandalism. Benches overturned, books scattered, chalk dust coating the floor like bitter snow. She sank onto her chair, momentarily overwhelmed. "They aim to break your spirit," came a voice from the doorway. Jonah stood there, toolbox in hand. "I reckon we shouldn't let them." Without waiting for permission, he began setting the room to rights. His calloused hands worked methodically, repairing splintered desk legs and loose floorboards. Eveline watched him for a moment before joining in, sweeping up the mess. "Silas Ward is behind this," she said, naming the wealthy rancher who controlled 3 seats on the town council. "He's never forgiven me for questioning where the school funds disappeared to." Jonah nodded, hammering a nail with precise strokes. "Ward doesn't like being challenged, especially by a woman." By midday, Sheriff Henry Lowe appeared at the doorway, looking uncomfortable in the school setting. "Miss Harper, I'm obliged to inform you that several parents are threatening to petition for your removal." "On what grounds, Sheriff?" she asked, standing tall despite her exhaustion. "Public indecency. Corrupting influence." He shifted his weight, avoiding her gaze. "You might consider resigning before things get uglier." "Tell them I'll be ready for students tomorrow morning, same as always." After the sheriff departed, Eveline collapsed onto a newly repaired bench. 23 students yesterday. How many tomorrow, I wonder? Jonah paused his work, studying her face. "Enough," he said simply. "The brave ones will come." That night, Eveline prepared her lessons with extra care, lighting the lantern long past midnight. When dawn broke over Dry Creek, She walked to the schoolhouse with her head high, Jonah's hat clutched in her hands like a talisman of courage. Whatever awaited her inside those walls, she would face it standing. The saloon's lantern light cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards as Evelyn Harper hesitated at the back entrance. She had never set foot in such an establishment before, but desperation had led her here. 3 days earlier, the last parent had withdrawn their child from her classroom, leaving her with empty benches and a heart full of doubt. Inside, May Doyle was counting the night's earnings, her fingers moving deftly through the worn dollar bills. The saloon owner looked up, surprise flickering across her face at the sight of the schoolteacher standing awkwardly in the doorway, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Miss Harper," May said, her voice lower than the rowdy chatter from the main room. "Folks might talk if they see you here." Evelyn lifted her chin slightly, the stubble of her shorn hair catching the dim light. "They already talk, Mrs. Doyle." Something like respect crossed May's features as she gestured toward a chair. The two women spoke in hushed tones about the school situation, about the children who would suffer without education. As Evelyn rose to leave, May pressed an envelope into her palm. "For coal and books," the saloon owner whispered. "My brother couldn't read. Died signing a contract he didn't understand." Evelyn's fingers closed around the unexpected gift, words of gratitude catching in her throat. From his corner table, Jonah Callahan watched the exchange, nursing a single whiskey he barely touched. The cowboy had always viewed May as a shrewd businesswoman, interested only in profit margins and keeping miners' glasses full. Yet here she was, supporting the very cause the town elders had tried to crush. The following morning, Jonah intercepted Evelyn on her way to the abandoned schoolhouse. "Saw you at the saloon," he said, falling into step beside her. "Are you going to lecture me about proper behavior too?" she asked, a defensive edge to her voice. He shook his head. "May Doyle surprised me. Never figured her for an ally." "People contain multitudes, Mr. Callahan." Evelyn's fingers unconsciously touched the envelope hidden in her pocket. "Sometimes the most unexpected people stand with you when others won't." The cowboy nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The saloon's always been where secrets and deals happen. Now it's where change might start. As they reached the schoolhouse, Evelyn unlocked the door with renewed determination. The money would buy coal for the winter and new primers for when, not if, the children returned. She tucked the envelope beneath a loose floorboard, alongside the railroad letters, safeguarding both her past and future hopes. "Thank you for not judging," she said quietly. Jonah tipped his hat, dry creaks changing. "Maybe it's time we all see people for who they truly are." The floorboard creaked beneath Jonah Callahan's boot as he helped Evelyn repair a broken desk in her small quarters behind the schoolhouse. His weathered hands paused as he noticed the plank shift unnaturally. Evelyn's quick intake of breath told him he'd stumbled upon something private. "I'm sorry," he said, starting to move away, but curiosity had already gotten the better of him. Evelyn hesitated, then knelt beside him. "It's all right," she whispered, lifting the loose board herself. Beneath it lay a small bundle of letters tied with twine, their edges worn from frequent handling. "From the railroad surveyors," she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she handed him one. "I've been corresponding with them for months." Jonah unfolded the paper carefully, his calloused fingers a stark contrast to the neat penmanship. The letter detailed plans for the coming railroad. Not just tracks and timetables, but opportunities for commerce, education, and growth. "You've been planning all this time," he said. Not a question, but a realization. The schoolteacher nodded, tucking a strand of her growing hair behind her ear. "Everyone sees the railroad as just steel and noise. But I see what it brings. Books from back east, new ideas, perhaps even funding for a proper school building." In the fading afternoon light, Jonah studied her face. The woman who had endured public shame now spoke of future possibilities with quiet fervor. Her eyes shone with the same determination he'd witnessed that day in the square. But there was something else there too. Hope, carefully guarded but undeniably alive. "The children deserve more than this town has given them," Eveline continued, gesturing to the cramped space around them. "More than just learning to survive. They should learn to dream." Jonah carefully refolded the letter. "Most folks here fear change," he said softly. "They'll fight you." "They already have," she replied with a small smile, touching her hair that had begun to grow into soft curls. "And yet, here we are." The cowboy nodded, understanding flowing between them without words. He helped her return the letters to their hiding place, his admiration for her growing with each passing moment. What had begun as a simple act of decency in the town square had evolved into something deeper, the shared vision of what Dry Creek might become. As they finished the repairs and stepped outside into the evening air, the distant sound of hammering from the direction of the approaching railroad line drifted toward them. That sound, once just noise on the wind, now carried the promise of transformation, for the town, for the children, and perhaps for them both. The first snow came early to Dry Creek that year, swirling down from the mountains without warning. By nightfall, the wind had transformed into a howling beast, hurling ice against windows and piling drifts against doors. Eveline Harper stood at her schoolhouse window, watching the white fury engulf the town, knowing what this meant for the outlying homesteads. "Many families won't be prepared," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Not this early in the season." By morning, word reached town of settlers trapped without sufficient supplies. Children arrived at school with stories of neighbors burning furniture for warmth, of pantries nearly bare. The school teacher's face grew solemn as she listened, her recently shorn hair now just long enough to curl slightly at her nape. "Today's lesson will be different," Eveline announced, pushing desks aside. "We're going to help those in need." She brought out fabric scraps she'd been saving, needles and thread from her personal supplies. The children watched, wide-eyed, as their teacher transformed the classroom into an impromptu workshop. Eveline demonstrated simple stitches, guiding small hands through the motions of creating patchwork blankets. "My pa says you're still causing trouble," whispered one girl, as Eveline helped her thread a needle. "Is helping your neighbors trouble?" Eveline asked gently. The girl considered this, then shook her head and returned to her stitching. Word of the schoolhouse workshop spread through town. May Doyle sent over remnants of heavy curtains from the saloon. Sheriff Lowe's wife contributed old woolen shirts. Even families who had pulled their children from school after Eveline's public shaming began to send materials. Jonah Callahan arrived with his wagon as the fourth day of blizzard conditions continued. His face was raw from cold, his eyes squinting against the brightness of snow. "Thought you might need help delivering these," he said, nodding toward the growing pile of completed blankets. Together, they loaded the wagon. The cowboy's hands, rough from ranch work, handled the children's stitched offerings with unexpected tenderness. As they prepared to depart, several parents who had previously turned away from Eveline now approached with additional supplies. "We misjudged you," admitted one father gruffly, unable to meet her eyes directly. For 3 days, Eveline and Jonah traveled between isolated homesteads, delivering blankets and provisions. They found families huddled around dying fires, gratitude shining in their eyes as warmth was restored. When they returned to town, something had shifted. The sideways glances at Eveline now held curiosity rather than contempt. Children who had been forbidden to attend school began reappearing in her classroom. "They're starting to see you," Jonah told her quietly as they unloaded the empty wagon. "Not what they want to see, but who you really are." Eveline touched her growing hair self-consciously, then straightened her shoulders. The blizzard had tested them all, but in its wake, something new was beginning to take root in Dry Creek. The early spring thaw had turned the old creek bed into a muddy mess, making Jonah Callahan's fence repair more challenging than expected. His boots sank into the soft earth as he worked, replacing rotted posts along the property line that bordered the schoolhouse grounds. When his shovel struck something solid with a dull thud, he assumed it was just another rock. Wyoming territory had no shortage of those. Instead, he unearthed a small wooden chest, its brass fittings green with age. The cowboy pried it open carefully, surprised to find a collection of papers inside, somehow preserved despite years underground. The name Harper caught his eye immediately. These belonged to Evelyn's father. Jonah wiped his mud-caked hands on his trousers before carefully examining the contents. Among various personal letters and deeds was a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with meticulous accounting of the school funds from years past. He wasn't a man of numbers, but even he could see the discrepancies. Money allocated for books and supplies that never materialized, funds earmarked for repairs that were never completed. That evening, he rode to Evelyn's small cottage behind the schoolhouse. The teacher answered his knock with surprise. Her growing hair, now just long enough to curl softly around her ears. "Found something you might want to see," he said simply, placing the chest on her kitchen table. Evelyn's hands trembled as she recognized her father's possessions. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, carefully turning the pages of the ledger. "Creek bed. Must have been hidden there before he passed." As she studied the documents, her expression shifted from nostalgia to shock. "These records show exactly what I suspected," she said, voice hardening. "Judge Wilson and Councilman Peters have been siphoning school money for years, even before I arrived in Dry Creek." Jonah leaned against the doorframe, hat in hand. "Your accusations weren't just suspicions. Father must have discovered their scheme and documented everything." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "This is why they were so quick to discredit me when I questioned the funds." The cowboy nodded slowly. "Question is, what do we do with this now?" Evelyn's fingers traced her father's handwriting. "We use it, not just for revenge, but to restore what was taken." She looked up at him, determination replacing grief. The children deserve better. The discovery changed something between them. A shared purpose beyond survival. This evidence could topple the power structure that had allowed her public humiliation, but wielding it would bring dangers of its own. "They won't take this lightly," Jonah warned. "I know," she replied, "but I'm not afraid anymore." The buried chest had unearthed more than corruption. It had revealed the depth of their resolve to see justice done in Dry Creek, whatever the cost. The Autumn County Fair arrived in Dry Creek with the promise of competition and celebration. Jonah Callahan had his eyes set on the $100 prize for the cattle drive contest, enough to replace the schoolhouse's leaking roof before winter. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity as families gathered around makeshift corrals, the scent of dust and livestock hanging in the air. "You sure about this?" May Doyle asked, leaning against the fence. "Everyone knows Silas has had his men practicing for weeks." Jonah merely nodded, adjusting his saddle. The cowboy wasn't one for many words, but determination lined his weathered face. From across the grounds, Silas Ward watched with a smug smile, whispering to his foreman. The wealthy rancher had made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any challenge to his standing in Dry Creek. When Jonah's turn came, he mounted his horse with practiced ease. The task seemed simple enough: guide 3 unruly steers through a series of gates within 2 minutes. But as he began, one steer suddenly bolted in an unnatural panic. Jonah spotted a ranch hand hiding behind the fence, waving a red cloth. Before he could react, another of Silas's men whistled sharply, causing the remaining cattle to scatter. Despite the obvious sabotage, Jonah refused to quit. He pushed his mount harder, cutting off the panicked steers with remarkable skill. The crowd grew silent, watching his determination with newfound respect. Even with the deck stacked against him, the cowboy nearly completed the course before time ran out. "That's not fair," shouted one of Evelyn Harper's young students from the crowd. Mr. Callahan was cheated, but the judges, all friends of Silas, declared the wealthy rancher's foreman the winner. As Jonah dismounted, his shoulder slammed against the fence when one of Ward's men accidentally bumped into him. "Better luck next year, Callahan," Silas called out, pocketing the prize money with a theatrical flourish. Later, behind the refreshment tent, Eveline found Jonah sitting alone, his face tight with pain. "Let me see," she said, gently examining his shoulder. Her fingers worked with surprising tenderness as she applied a cold compress. "Everyone saw what happened out there. You won in the ways that matter." "Roof won't see it that way when the snow comes," he replied softly. Eveline's eyes met his. "We'll find another way. The children are already planning a fundraiser." Something shifted between them in that quiet moment, a deepening of trust, perhaps even more. The schoolteacher's hand lingered on his arm, neither of them speaking the thoughts that passed between them. "Thank you," Jonah finally said, covering her hand with his own. Around them, the fair continued, but in that small space behind the tent, a different kind of victory had been won. The midwinter night shattered with screams as orange flames engulfed May Doyle's saloon. The blaze started in the kitchen, where a lamp had toppled during a particularly rowdy card game, and within minutes, the dry wooden structure became a roaring inferno. Patrons stumbled out, coughing into the snow-dusted street, but several workers remained trapped inside, the kitchen staff and two barmaids who'd been cornered by the rapidly spreading fire. Eveline Harper was walking home from a late evening of grading papers when she spotted the commotion. Without hesitation, she dropped her satchel and ran toward the blazing building. Sheriff Henry Lowe was attempting to organize a bucket line, but the flames were too fierce for water to make much difference. "May's girls are still inside," someone shouted, as the saloon owner herself stood trembling, her face illuminated by the hellish glow of her burning livelihood. Eveline grabbed a water-soaked blanket from the bucket line and wrapped it around herself. "Where?" she demanded. "Back storeroom," May replied, her voice cracking. "But you can't." The schoolteacher was already moving, ducking low beneath the smoke that billowed from the entrance. Inside, the heat struck like a physical blow. Crouching, she navigated through the main room where abandoned drinks still sat on tables, being consumed by flames. The smoke stung her eyes and scorched her lungs, but she pressed forward, calling out for the trapped workers. Outside, Jonah Callahan arrived on horseback, dismounting in a fluid motion. When told of Eveline's actions, his weathered face paled. Without a word, he soaked his bandana and tied it across his face before following her path into the inferno. They emerged minutes later, Eveline supporting a coughing barmaid, Jonah carrying an unconscious cook over his shoulder, with the second barmaid clinging to his arm. As they stumbled clear of the building, the roof collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks and timber. The townsfolk who had gathered to watch the disaster fell silent. There stood Eveline, her hair singed, face blackened with soot, dress scorched, helping the rescued workers onto hastily arranged blankets in the snow. The same woman they had mocked and shunned months before had just risked her life without hesitation. "Why?" Silas Ward asked, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Why would you do that for May's people?" Eveline looked up, her eyes bright against her smoke-darkened face. "They're not just May's people. They're Dry Creek's people." The statement hung in the air like the embers floating skyward. Sheriff Lowe removed his hat in a gesture of respect, and others followed suit. May embraced Eveline fiercely, whispering thanks through tears. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, something had shifted in Dry Creek. The fire had burned away more than just the saloon. It had consumed some of the prejudice that had defined the town for so long. In its place, a reluctant admiration began to grow. The hoofbeats faded into the night as Eveline Harper was dragged from her small cottage, a rough burlap sack thrown over her head. Three men, their faces hidden behind bandanas, had broken in while she prepared for bed. They worked for the town elders, men who'd grown tired of her defiance and the changes she represented. "She needs to learn her place," one muttered as they rode through the biting cold, Evelyn bound and shivering across a saddle. Jonah Callahan discovered her absence at dawn when he arrived to repair her leaking roof. The kicked-in door and overturned furniture told him everything. Without hesitation, he gathered supplies and mounted his horse, his jaw set with determination. The winter landscape stretched before him, cruel and unforgiving. Snow had fallen overnight, partially obscuring the tracks, but Jonah had spent years reading trails that others couldn't see. He followed the faint impressions, noting broken twigs and disturbed snowdrifts that marked their passage into the hills. "Hold on, Evelyn," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I'm coming." The wind picked up as morning turned to afternoon, driving ice crystals against his face until his skin felt raw and chapped. His fingers, despite thick gloves, grew numb around the reins. Still, the cowboy pushed forward, stopping only to rest his horse and check the trail. Doubt crept in as daylight began to fade. What if he was following the wrong path? What if they'd already hurt her? The thought made his chest tighten. Since that day in the square, when he'd placed his hat on her shorn head, something had changed in him. The quiet life he'd built seemed hollow without her courage lighting the way. Near dusk, smoke from a chimney caught his eye, a trapper's cabin tucked against the hillside. Jonah approached cautiously, tethering his mount behind a stand of pines. 3 horses stood in a makeshift corral, confirming his suspicions. Through a grimy window, he spotted Evelyn tied to a chair, her face bruised but her eyes still defiant. 2 men played cards at a table, while a third dozed by the fire. The sheriff's deputy, Jonah realized with disgust. The very man sworn to uphold the law. Jonah circled the cabin, formulating a plan. A direct confrontation would be dangerous, 3 against 1, with Evelyn caught in the middle. Instead, he crept to the corral and spooked the horses, sending them crashing through the underbrush. When the men rushed outside, cursing and fumbling for their weapons, Jonah slipped through the back door. Evelyn's eyes widened at the sight of him. "You came," she whispered as he cut her bonds. "Always will," he replied simply, helping her to her feet. They escaped into the gathering darkness, the wilderness ahead less frightening than what lay behind. The journey home would test them both, but neither doubted they would make it together. Sheriff Henry Lowe stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow drift down in the pale morning light. His 10-year-old son Timothy sat at the table behind him, pushing eggs around his plate. "Pa, when's Miss Harper coming back to teach us?" Timothy asked, his voice small but determined. "I ain't learned nothing proper since she's been gone." Henry turned, studying his boy's earnest face. The same boy who'd come home weeks ago, excitedly explaining how Miss Harper had taught them about stars and planets. Things Henry himself had never understood. "It ain't right what they did to her," Timothy continued. "She's the best teacher we ever had." The sheriff's weathered face remained impassive, but inside, doubt gnawed at him. He'd stood in that square months ago, watching Evelyn Harper's humiliation, doing nothing to stop it. He'd even helped enforce the elder's will afterward, warning her to keep quiet about the missing school funds. Later that morning, Henry walked Dry Creek's main street, noting how the town had fractured since Evelyn's abduction. Neighbors who'd shared meals for years now passed without speaking. The general store buzzed with whispered arguments. Outside May Doyle's saloon, 2 men nearly came to blows over whether the schoolteacher deserved what had happened. "Town's tearing itself apart," muttered Deputy Collins, falling into step beside him. Henry nodded grimly. "And for what? A woman who just wanted to teach our children?" By midday, reports arrived that Jonah Callahan was tracking Evelyn through the foothills, battling the winter elements to find her. Something shifted in the sheriff's heart, the image of his son's disappointed face merging with the memory of Evelyn's quiet dignity as they'd cut her hair. That evening, as townsfolk gathered at the meeting hall to discuss the situation, Henry Lowe made his decision. He pushed through the crowd, climbed onto the small wooden platform, and removed his badge. "I've enforced laws in this town for 11 years, he announced. his voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. But there's a difference between law and justice. He placed his badge on the table. I'm riding out at first light to help Callahan bring Miss Harper home. Anyone who stands against her return will answer to me. Badge or no badge. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Silas Ward stood up, face flushed with anger. You're betraying this town, Lowe. No, the sheriff replied calmly. I'm finally serving it properly. The meeting dissolved into chaos, some pledging to ride with Henry, others storming out in disgust. May Doyle caught his eye from the back of the room and nodded her approval. Dry Creek stood at a crossroads that night, with families divided and loyalties tested. The community that had weathered droughts, blizzards, and hardship now faced its greatest challenge, choosing between comfortable cruelty and difficult change. The blizzard howled like a wounded beast as Jonah Callahan tracked the faint impressions in the snow. 3 days of relentless pursuit had led him to this remote cabin nestled against the foothills, its chimney smoke barely visible through the swirling white. His fingers, numb despite thick gloves, gripped his rifle as he surveyed the isolated structure. Inside, Eveline Harper sat bound to a wooden chair, her regrown hair falling across her face. 2 men, hired by the town elders, played cards by lamplight, occasionally glancing at their captive with disinterest. The schoolteacher had refused food for a day, her silent defiance the only weapon left to her. Jonah circled the cabin, noting the single horse tethered at the back. The blizzard provided perfect cover as he crept closer. When one captor stepped outside to relieve himself, the cowboy struck with swift efficiency, rendering the man unconscious before he could cry out. Taking the man's coat, Jonah entered the cabin with his hat pulled low. "'Bout time you got back," the remaining captor muttered without looking up from his cards. Jonah's response came in the form of his revolver pressed against the man's temple. "Not who you're expecting," he said quietly. The shock in Eveline's eyes turned to relief as she recognized her rescuer. Working quickly, Jonah bound the second captor and cut Eveline's ropes. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst. "Always," he replied simply, helping her to her feet. They had no time for reunion. The storm was intensifying, and they needed to move before the unconscious man outside recovered. Jonah wrapped Eveline in the spare blanket from his pack and led her to the waiting horse. The journey back to Dry Creek was a brutal test of endurance. Riding double on the mare, they fought through wind-driven snow that cut like glass. Eveline clung to Jonah's back, her strength fading as the hours passed. When the horse stumbled in a drift, they continued on foot, the cowboy half carrying the schoolteacher through the worst of the storm. "Leave me," she murmured once, when exhaustion threatened to claim them both. "Not a chance," Jonah answered, his arm tightening around her waist. Dawn was breaking when they finally stumbled into town. Word spread quickly, and townsfolk emerged from their homes to witness their return. Sheriff Henry Lowe was the first to reach them, his face a mask of conflicted emotion, as he helped Eveline to the doctor's house. In the days that followed, something shifted in Dry Creek. Those who had once jeered at Eveline's humiliation now averted their eyes in shame. Children brought small gifts to her doorstep. Even Silas Ward's wife sent a basket of preserves, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps they had been wrong. The ordeal had forged something unbreakable between Jonah and Eveline, a bond beyond words, tempered in snow and suffering. They rarely spoke of the rescue, but sometimes, when their eyes met across a crowded room, the memory passed between them like a current, the promise kept, the trust vindicated. The bitter Wyoming winter had settled over Dry Creek like a heavy blanket, bringing with it not just snow, but a renewed wave of hostility. Eveline Harper arrived at the schoolhouse one frigid morning to find its weathered boards defaced with crude insults and accusations. Harlot, thief, and worse declarations were splashed across the walls in dark paint, visible to anyone passing by. The schoolteacher stood motionless, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air as she absorbed the cruelty. Word spread quickly. By midday, several of her students had gathered at the vandalized building, their young faces a mixture of anger and determination. 12-year-old Thomas, the sheriff's son, was the first to speak up. "Miss Harper, we can fix this," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "Pa has paint in the shed. He said we can use it." Eveline felt her throat tighten. "This isn't your burden to bear," she managed. But the children were already organizing themselves. The next morning, a Saturday, she arrived to find nearly 15 of her pupils armed with brushes, buckets, and rags. Sheriff Henry Lowe himself delivered the supplies, offering a gruff nod that spoke volumes about his changing allegiance. The children worked tirelessly, covering the hateful words with fresh white paint, their small hands steady despite the cold. "My ma says you're the best teacher Dry Creek's ever had," whispered Emma, a quiet girl who rarely spoke in class. She told Pa to stop listening to Mr. Ward's nonsense. By afternoon, Jonah Callahan appeared, silently joining the effort. The cowboy worked alongside the children, his strong hands guiding theirs when the higher sections proved challenging. His presence lent legitimacy to their cause, and passers-by who might have jeered instead hurried along, avoiding his steady gaze. May Doyle sent over hot chocolate and bread from the saloon, an unexpected kindness that warmed both bodies and spirits. "Tell the schoolmarm this town needs more backbone like hers," she instructed the delivery boy loudly enough for others to hear. As dusk approached and the freshly painted walls gleamed in the fading light, Eveline gathered her helpers in a circle. "What you've done today," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "is the finest lesson I could ever hope to teach." That evening, 3 families who had withdrawn their children returned to enroll them again. The tide was turning slowly but surely. Standing before her small mirror that night, Eveline ran her fingers through her hair, now grown into a soft cap of curls. Like her reputation in Dry Creek, it was regenerating, different than before, but perhaps stronger for having been cut down. The lantern's glow spilled from the schoolhouse windows, casting long shadows across Dry Creek's main street. Eveline Harper had posted no announcements, sent no formal invitations. Yet every Tuesday and Thursday evening, a dozen girls between 9 and 16 years of age slipped through the back door of the schoolhouse, books clutched to their chests, eyes bright with anticipation. "Arithmetic isn't just for the boys," Eveline told them on the first night, her voice soft but resolute. "Neither is history, nor science, nor the ability to speak your mind." The girls sat straighter in their seats, some exchanging nervous glances, others nodding eagerly. Word spread through town like wildfire. At the general store, mothers whispered behind shelves of canned goods. In the saloon, May Doyle overheard heated debates about whether girls needed more than basic reading and writing. "They'll be wives and mothers," one man argued. "What use is algebra to them?" When Sheriff Lowe questioned the propriety of these gatherings, Eveline stood her ground. "I'm using my own time and my own supplies," she said, her regrown hair now framing her face in soft waves. "And I'm teaching them what they deserve to know." 3 weeks in, Clara Wilson's father stormed into the evening class, intending to drag his daughter home. He froze in the doorway, watching Clara confidently solve an equation on the blackboard. The pride in the girl's eyes when Eveline praised her work made him pause. He left without a word, but Clara returned the following session with a new slate and pencils her father had purchased. Jonah observed these changes from a distance. One evening, he brought firewood for the schoolhouse stove, arriving as the girls were leaving. Their animated chatter about the stars and planets they'd studied that night made him smile. When the last student departed, he found Eveline organizing papers at her desk. "You're changing things," he said simply, placing another log in the stove. The schoolteacher looked up. Exhaustion and determination mingled in her expression. "Someone has to." Jonah nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "Some folks in town are coming around. Even old Peterson mentioned his granddaughter seems smarter these days." Eveline laughed softly. She always was smart. Now she's allowed to show it. As they walked together under the vast Wyoming sky, Jonah realized how much he craved this. Not just Eveline's company, but the quiet certainty that they were building something worthwhile. The cowboy who had once drifted from town to town now found himself dreaming of permanence, of mornings and evenings with this woman whose courage had awakened his own. In Dry Creek, where change came slowly as winter thaw, these evening classes were seeds planted in fertile ground, small beginnings of a harvest neither of them could yet imagine. The spring gathering brought Dry Creek to life after the long winter. Colorful bunting decorated the fairgrounds, and the scent of roasted corn and apple pie filled the air. Jonah Callahan stood at the edge of the makeshift arena, watching as riders were thrown from bucking broncos, one after another. His shoulder, injured during the winter rescue, throbbed beneath his worn shirt, but determination hardened his features. "You ain't thinking of riding today, are you?" Sheriff Henry Lowe approached, eyeing the cowboy with concern. Jonah nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the wild-eyed bronco being led into the pen. The prize money, $50, would cover the schoolhouse repairs that Eveline desperately needed. Word had spread that Silas Ward had convinced several parents to withdraw their children, claiming the school was unsafe after winter damage. "That shoulder won't hold," Henry warned, but stepped aside as Jonah moved toward the registration table. From across the gathering, Eveline Harper watched with worry etched across her face. Her hair had grown into a short cap of curls, no longer the mark of shame it once was. She pushed through the crowd as Jonah handed over his entry fee, the last of his savings. "You don't need to do this," she whispered, touching his arm gently. The cowboy's eyes softened momentarily. "The school needs a new roof before the spring rains." The crowd parted as Jonah approached the pen. Many still remembered his public defiance months ago, and whispers followed him. Some hoped to see him fail, while others, those whose children still attended Eveline's classes, silently rooted for his success. When his turn came, Jonah climbed atop the fence with practiced ease that belied his injury. A bronco, a massive black beast with wild eyes, snorted and pawed the earth. In one fluid motion, he dropped onto the animal's back. The gates swung open. The bronco exploded from the pen, twisting and bucking with savage fury. Pain shot through Jonah's shoulder with each violent movement, but his face revealed nothing as he clung to the animal. 8 seconds stretched into eternity as the crowd counted aloud. When the horn finally sounded, he dismounted with as much dignity as his battered body allowed. 3 more riders followed. None lasted as long. At sundown, May Doyle handed Jonah the prize money, her eyes reflecting respect rarely shown to anyone in her establishment. The saloon owner had seen his struggle, recognized his sacrifice. Later, as lanterns illuminated the fairgrounds, Jonah found Eveline by the schoolhouse. Wordlessly, he pressed the money into her palm, his calloused fingers lingering against her soft skin. "For the children," he said simply. Eveline's eyes welled with tears as she noticed the way he favored his shoulder, the fresh bruises darkening his jaw. His sacrifice spoke louder than any declaration. In that moment, the schoolteacher understood that some men prove their hearts not through grand gestures, but through quiet, painful endurance. The theft of Jonah Callahan's prized mare sent ripples of concern through Dry Creek. The animal wasn't just transportation. She was his partner in work, a companion through lonely nights on the range. When tracks led toward the rugged foothills that bordered the Wyoming territory, Jonah prepared for pursuit with grim determination. Packing provisions and ammunition, the cowboy planned to leave at first light, his jaw set in that familiar way that brooked no argument. "I'm coming with you," Evelyn Harper announced, standing in his doorway with a small pack already slung over her shoulder. Her hair, growing out from the humiliation months before, curled softly around her face. Jonah shook his head. "Too dangerous. These men won't hesitate to—" "I won't be left behind again," she interrupted, her voice steady. "Not after what happened this winter." The memory of her abduction hung between them, unspoken but powerful. The cowboy studied her face, recognizing the same resolve that had kept her teaching despite threats and mockery. Finally, he nodded once. They set out as dawn broke over the eastern plains, following hoofprints that told a story of 3 riders heading northwest. Evelyn proved a capable rider, keeping pace without complaint, even as the terrain grew treacherous. By midday, they spotted smoke rising from a sheltered ravine. "Stay behind me," Jonah whispered as they dismounted, tethering their horses to a scrub oak. The schoolteacher touched his arm. "We approach together or not at all." They crept forward, finding 2 men camped beside a small fire. Jonah's mare was tethered nearby, along with other horses bearing unfamiliar brands. "Horse thieves passing through," he murmured. "Dangerous men." Evelyn surveyed the camp with calculating eyes. "The 3rd man must be hunting. We need a distraction." What followed tested them both. While Jonah created a diversion upwind, Evelyn slipped toward the animals. When chaos erupted, she cut the mare free, leading her away from the camp with steady hands that betrayed none of her fear. The reunion was brief as the 3rd thief returned, forcing them to flee through unfamiliar territory. For hours they navigated treacherous slopes, the mare following trustingly behind them. That night, sheltered in a rocky overhang, Jonah watched Evelyn tend the small fire. "You've changed," he observed quietly. She looked up, firelight playing across her features. "Not changed, just found what was always there." The cowboy nodded, understanding completely. This woman, who had faced public shame, now faced danger without flinching. Their partnership, forged in defiance and deepened through shared struggles, had become something neither could have imagined that scorching August day in the town square. By the time they returned to Dry Creek 3 days later, something fundamental had shifted between them. Equals now in courage as well as conviction. The wagon train appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a caravan of immigrants seeking new beginnings in the West. By midday, Dry Creek's single street was lined with unfamiliar faces speaking a dozen different languages, their possessions piled high on carts and backs. Evelyn Harper watched from the schoolhouse steps as children darted between strangers, wide-eyed at the colorful fabrics and strange accents. A woman with a thick German accent approached her, 3 small children clinging to her skirts. She asked, her face weathered but hopeful, "My Friedrich, Greta, and little Hans, they need learning." The schoolteacher smiled, explaining the enrollment process while conscious of Mrs. Whitaker and her sewing circle watching from across the street, their whispers carrying on the spring breeze. The old gossip about her public humiliation had quieted over the months, but never truly died. "That's the one they sheared like a sheep," Mrs. Whitaker told a newcomer. "Living in sin with that cowboy, they say." Jonah leaned against the hitching post outside the general store, overhearing everything. His jaw tightened, but he kept his peace. Time had taught him that actions spoke louder than confrontations. That evening at May Doyle's establishment, the saloon buzzed with mixed opinions. A railroad surveyor raised his glass to Evelyn's health, praising her dedication to education. "A town that values learning is a town with a future," he declared. Others weren't so kind. A cattle buyer passing through snickered, "Heard they cut her hair for loose morals. Seems fitting for this backward place." May slammed his whiskey down hard enough to splash. "You'll respect Miss Harper in my establishment or drink elsewhere," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Several regulars nodded in agreement, men who once would have joined in the mockery. Outside, Sheriff Henry Lowe found himself explaining to curious newcomers about the changes in Dry Creek. "Things aren't always what they seem," he admitted reluctantly. "The teachers got more backbone than most men I know." By week's end, the immigrants had moved on, but their presence had stirred the pot of Dry Creek's social order. At Sunday service, Eveline sat with 3 new families who had decided to stay. Families whose children now filled her classroom's back row. Mrs. Whitaker's circle had shrunk by 2 members, women who now greeted the teacher with cautious nods. The outsider's fresh perspectives had forced many to reconsider their judgments, though others doubled down on old resentments. "They'll see your worth eventually," Jonah told her as they walked home. "Some folks just take longer to grow than others." Eveline touched her hair, grown just past her ears now, and smiled. "I'm not waiting for their approval anymore." The blizzard came without warning, howling across the Wyoming territory like a vengeful spirit. Jonah Callahan had weathered many winters on the plains, but none as merciless as this one. Ice formed on his eyelashes as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward his struggling herd, the cattle huddled together against the biting wind. 3 days into the storm, Jonah lost 4 head to the cold. By the 5th day, that number had doubled. He worked himself to exhaustion, moving the surviving animals to whatever shelter he could find, breaking ice on water troughs with his bare hands until they cracked and bled. Each morning, he'd discover another still form beneath the snow, another loss he couldn't afford. "You're killing yourself for those beasts," May told him when he stumbled into the saloon one evening, his face raw from windburn. The saloon owner pushed a whiskey toward him. "No shame in cutting your losses." But the cowboy merely shook his head. These cattle weren't just livestock. They represented everything he'd built since arriving in Dry Creek. Every dollar he'd managed to give Eveline for the school had come from their sale. Every promise of a future rested on their survival. When the second storm hit, Jonah moved the remaining cattle into his own barn, sleeping beside them on a bed of hay. He awoke to find his fingers too stiff to grip his coffee cup. Still, he persisted, rubbing liniment into frozen udders and coaxing weakened calves to stand. Sheriff Lowe found him unconscious near the creek one afternoon, having fallen while carrying feed. "You've got frostbite," the lawman said, helping Jonah to his feet. "Let someone else tend your herd before you lose more than cattle." "There is no one else," Jonah replied, his voice hoarse. That evening, a knock at his door revealed Eveline Harper, her arms laden with supplies. "I've brought medicine," she said simply, stepping past him into the cabin. "And I've arranged for 3 of the older boys to help with morning and evening feedings." "I didn't ask for charity," he muttered, pride stinging worse than his frostbitten ears. "It's not charity," the schoolteacher replied, unwrapping his damaged hands to apply salve. "It's what neighbors do." As February gave way to March, Jonah's herd was half its former size. His savings were depleted, his body battered. Yet watching Eveline organize the town's children to help with his livestock, he realized something profound. The roots he'd been reluctant to plant had taken hold without his notice. "I might lose everything," he admitted one evening as they sat by his fire. Eveline took his scarred hand in hers. "Not everything," she whispered. "Not what matters most." The iron tracks gleamed in the spring sunlight as the first locomotive thundered into Dry Creek, belching smoke and possibility into the Wyoming air. Townsfolk gathered along the newly built platform, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. Eveline Harper stood among them, her regrown hair catching the breeze as she watched this harbinger of change arrive with a screech of brakes and a blast of steam. "Never thought I'd see the day," May Doyle murmured beside her, the saloon owner's shrewd eyes already calculating the influx of potential customers. "Your letters finally bore fruit." Within a week, Dry Creek transformed. Land that had sold for pennies now commanded dollars. The general store expanded its inventory, and 3 new establishments broke ground along Main Street. Strangers with crisp suits and leather portfolios strode through town, buying parcels and making promises. Jonah watched it all with cautious optimism. The cowboy had seen boomtowns rise and fall across the territory, but something felt different here. Perhaps it was the way Eveline had prepared the children, teaching them arithmetic and business principles that now proved valuable as their parents navigated new opportunities. "They're calling you the town's visionary," he told her one evening as they walked past the schoolhouse. "Those railroad men were impressed by your knowledge of their operations." She smiled, touching the weathered hat she still kept on her desk. "And they're calling you the stubbornest rancher in 3 counties for refusing to sell your grazing land." Silas Ward was less pleased with the changes. The wealthy rancher had expected to control all dealings with the railroad, but found himself outmaneuvered when Sheriff Henry Lowe enforced fair bidding practices for the new contracts. "You've made powerful enemies," the sheriff warned Eveline after a particularly heated town meeting. "Ward's influence may be waning, but he's dangerous when cornered." "I've faced worse," she replied, remembering the sting of shears against her scalp nearly a year before. The schoolteacher now found herself consulted on matters beyond education. Newcomers, unaware of her previous humiliation, saw only a capable woman who understood both progress and tradition. Children of railroad workers filled her classroom, bringing diverse experiences that enriched her lessons. Even as prosperity bloomed, corruption festered in shadows. Anonymous threats appeared on Eveline's door, and Jonah's fence lines were mysteriously cut. The old guard would not surrender power easily. Yet each morning, the locomotive's whistle reminded them that Dry Creek stood at a crossroads of possibility. The town that had once gathered to witness Eveline's shame now looked to her as they navigated uncertain waters, her resilience becoming the blueprint for their collective courage. The spring gathering transformed Dry Creek Square into a tapestry of color and sound. Railroad men in press suits mingled with townsfolk as the scent of apple blossoms drifted on the breeze. Eveline Harper stood on the makeshift platform, her voice carrying across the crowd with newfound authority. The soft curls that had grown back after her humiliation caught the sunlight, no longer a mark of shame, but a badge of resilience. "Our children deserve more than broken desks and outdated books," she declared, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, some still hostile, others filled with newfound respect. "With the railroad's arrival, we have an opportunity to build something lasting here, not just tracks and stations, but minds and futures." Jonah Callahan stood beside her, his weathered face set with quiet determination. The cowboy who had once been known only for his silence now commanded attention with his mere presence. His shoulder, still bearing the scars of winter's trials, brushed against Eveline's as he stepped forward to add his voice to hers. "This town has seen its share of hardship," he said, each word deliberate and measured. "But we've also seen courage grow in unexpected places." His eyes found May Doyle in the crowd, the saloon owner nodding in acknowledgement of their shared journey. Sheriff Henry Lowe, once their adversary and now their cautious ally, kept the peace as Silas Ward and his supporters muttered their disapproval from the edges of the gathering. The wealthy rancher's influence had waned with each passing month as the railroad brought new voices and perspectives to Dry Creek. After the speeches, as fiddles struck up a lively tune, Eveline reached for Jonah's wide-brimmed hat, the same one he had placed upon her shorn head nearly a year before. She set it atop her curls with a smile that spoke volumes to those who remembered that day. "Some things come full circle," she murmured, her fingers brushing his calloused hand. "And some things change forever," he replied, drawing her close. Their kiss, witnessed by the entire town, was no longer an act of defiance, but a celebration. Children from Eveline's school cheered, their education now secured by town ordinance and railroad funding. Parents who had once pulled their children from her classroom now approached with congratulations and apologies. As the sun began to set over Dry Creek, painting the new railroad station in gold, the legend of the schoolteacher and the cowboy settled into the town's foundations. Their story would be told for generations, how shame turned to honor, how silence transformed into strength, and how a single act of courage in a dusty square changed everything. In the Wyoming Territory of 1876, where the wild winds carried both rumors and reckonings, love and principle had taken root and bloomed against all odds.